Hi, everybody, and welcome to our next edition of Coaching for the Soul. We're going to start off today with Jen, who's going to kick us off by talking about shining the light on something and seeing what it is. So, thanks, Jen. Over to you.
Thanks, Graham. Yeah, my first job way before I came across any of this inside out understanding or even knew what coaching was in hospitality management. It was my first job out of education, and the pub that I was working in was a um, particularly picturesque. If you were to imagine a typical British countryside pub, you'd probably be imagining this black and white timber uh, building, tucked behind a church which had its own graveyard in the middle of nowhere, even rumored to have its own ghost. And because it was an old nunnery part of it, it was supposed to have a tunnel that was led across to the church. So there was lots of history towards this and a really beautiful place to work. And when I was invited to join the management team, um, because I'd worked there as a student, I thought, why not? Wasn't my plan, but yeah, I enjoy working there. And for a bit, the manager always insisted on coming and locking up with me. And at first I thought, oh, that's really supportive. And after several weeks of him always insisting on coming to look up for me, I began going in my head, oh, he doesn't trust me. You know, why have they invited me to join the team if they don't trust me to do something relatively simple as locking up? And I had huge stories in my head about this until after a while I was let into the secret of what actually was going on, in the fact that the police had got a tip off that armed gang of robbers were potentially going to hit our pub at closing one night. So he was just being really protective because they had installed panic alarms, but only the manager and living chef knew where they were. So I went, oh, my head hadn't gone with that story. That wasn't right. So to cut that story short, we never actually got hit by that thing at that. So that was in the summer. So come the winter when we had lovely log roaring fires again, I'd been permitted to start locking up on my own. And there was one night where I'd done everything. We'd all done all the evening stuff of setting out the tables ready for the next day, rearranging all the furniture because the combination of tables wouldn't have fitted otherwise. And the staff had gone. My colleague who was giving me a lift home was waiting for me outside in the car when I went to set the alarm and then thought, did I check that fire was off? Oh, I better go and check the dining room. So went off into the dining room and froze because in the corner was this tall, shadowy figure. And my head immediately went to, oh my God, it's happening. The robbers have arrived. And at that moment, my colleague obviously it got cold in the car, turned the headlights on, which so illuminating light through the window. And what was actually in the corner was the coat rack, which someone had left this long, tall coat on. So it wasn't what I'd imagined it to be. It just required light to be shone in from the distance. And I think we often do that in our own heads. There are stuff that we think, oh, I mustn't dig too much into that one because that's scary. And it can be very much a case of when we actually shine a light on it, it's non existent. There'll be questions that we've got in our own heads that we don't think to question. You know, am I good enough? For what? You know, is that really useful? What's up with me? You know, whose question is that? Whose thought is that? So I guess the question is, how do we notice change? Because shining the light of it is one of those ways of going about it. And I don't know how that resonates with the rest of you, but that's what occurred to me.
Yeah, but there's so many examples in that, like seeing something that's not there. It kind of leads me to this kind of question about like almost what rules are we living our life by, and have we looked at any of those, and which of those may be made up, or which of those aren't? And this kind of the negative thinking, I think, of the kind of am I enough? Is something wrong with me? Those kind of things, like, well, they certainly have a particular feel to them, but yeah, just lead me to thinking about, well, yeah, the thought come with a meaning, or have I given it meaning? And I think what you described there was a whole host of scenarios that came with one meaning, that when you got curious, actually there was something else playing out. And I guess the power in, okay, if it works that way there, where else might it be working the same way?
Mm. Yeah, very much about, for me, it shows how we're living the experience of how we create the world with our thinking. Because that was just a coat stand. But in my head, it was a bank robber with a gun.
Hmm. Yeah. And there can be like a huge amount of fear in that, can't there? Like, and I guess that speaks to the power of thought in terms of the emotion that can go with it. I since we seem to be going back in time, it reminds me of when I went back after like a summer break to my student house that I lived in, and one of the lights was on, and kind of similar thing. Suddenly I was like, like nobody's meant to be back. It's just me. And like I remember, I think what I did was to call my parents and go around, will you just walk in with me while I go round? But the fear was there, like I could really feel it. And again, caused by my thinking, because if I'd had a different thought, which was, oh, somebody's popped in over the summer and forgotten to turn the light off, well, I wouldn't even have done any of that. So, yeah, that kind of idea of how does our thinking drive our behavior, like in all of those scenarios, like we did something because we imagined something, but the imagined something wasn't real. Hmm.
Me speaking, speaking.
Hmm.
Um, this is to me a classic example of the snake and the rope. You know, we have a phobia, and it's like phobias. We have this fear of something that we imagine, but in reality, it's something else. It's, if we're in a dark and we have a phobia of snakes, and there's something that looks like a shape of a snake on the ground, because our limited perception of it's based on our, because it's so dark, that we see this vague form of a snake because it's so dark. We think because of our automatic habitual thought, anything that looks like a snake is a snake. Even if we were to think logically, how can a snake can even exist in this room when there's no snakes that even are remotely in this part of the world? But once I can see oneself going, yeah, but maybe someone had a pet snake and like it got loose and somehow it got through the vent and blah blah blah. And then someone knocks on the door and you're like hysterically going, please, please open the door and help me. And someone reaches in and opens the door and turns on the light and you're like shrieking and jumping up and down, like, get the snake, get this. And then you look in the corner, it's just a coiled up rope. So someone turned on the light to show that what it was, yet the visceral response of a person was the complete opposite. It was completely real in a person's head. Now, if that was a real snake, that would be a response that would be probably, for most people, valid, you know. But for another person, be a snake charmer, it was like, oh, let's have some fun. Let's charm the snake. Or it may be just that snake, you know, a person's like, I've held snakes before, and most snakes are pretty harmless. You know, they just, in fact, they like to be with you because you're warm and they're cold-blooded. So, and then they don't really try to strangle you or anything like that. But if I were to show that picture to uh, a relative that has snake phobias, just that picture would trigger them to react somatically in a way that it's alive to them right there and there. Um, so shining a light on something doesn't necessarily kind of help a person. Um, if one really believes that a snake, for example, is, I don't know what goes on in a person's head, it just automatically triggers a fear response. With some of my family friends and friends, they have a fear of spiders. So, eh, or mice, you know, you name it, someone's got a fear of something. So how can um, shining a light on that help? I don't know. How does one guide a person from experiencing the fear of something versus seen as just the spider? And there's no, or a mouse. Does anyone have any suggestions on that?
Don't know if there's a how-to this, but for me, what we've all been pointing to is that how we're thinking about something in our heads explains our behavior. And that feelings that we've been describing is that internal signal to ourselves that we've drifted away from home, for want of a better description, to give us our bearings back. Because there's a difference between when we're frightening ourselves in the head with the coat hat or the coiled rope, whatever it is that we've made up, and when we're in genuine danger. There's a different feel to that. So I think the way we're designed is set up to point us back again. And we try and complicate it by looking for the how to. Because I know I've been asked on more than one occasion, but how do I do that? How do I drop a thought? Because that's all it normally is, even if we've lost track of that, because it feels like we're in this multi-speaker, three-dimensional movie that's moving around us.
I like the invitation, I guess, in that that there's not something to have to do. Because I think as we were talking before, I was thinking, okay, then, so how do we avoid that situation happening again? Like, how do we change it? What can we do? And I imagine there is an element of habit and frequency and seeing how many times it's not the thing we thought that's helpful there. But actually, there isn't anything to do because the moment we're distracted, we're onto something else, and the thought and the feeling that came with it has gone away. So, yeah, shining the light on something almost, I guess, is like a something to do, but actually there's nothing to do. Like, Edwin, is anything coming up for you as we explore this topic?
So I'm late to the dance, but thanks to Naoki for sharing with the theme and hearing you. Kind of a contradicting thoughts popped in as I was hearing you guys, and then it kind of settled. And then, to me right now is what's new and fresh and exciting, specifically as we got into this conversation, shining the light on our thoughts. It really doesn't require effort or a special skill. To me, I think it's simply a matter of noticing it. Is that kind of a loving, gentle reminder that we're not our thoughts, that we are the awareness behind them. And by being that awareness behind them, we also become the light that illuminates them. The thoughts are neutral, right? And they remain neutral until we start assigning meaning to them. Before that, a thought is just a thought. And if a thought is just a thought is not who I am. It's not reality. So it doesn't hold any power over me unless I get caught up into my own thinking. And then I give it, that kind of a weight, that kind of importance to it, and try to fight it. Then it feels real. Until I go back and understand and shine that light into it, that it's just a thought. And it doesn't require any effort. Just noticing for what it is. That's what came out to me at the end after Graham talked about what you guys have been discussing right now.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me to, well, if a thought is just a thought, and we could notice that more often, like, that feels like quite a freeing place to be. Because I think I would have seen that. We've talked about some examples today, but I imagine still there are parts of the day where I have all sorts of stories going on rather than just waiting for what feels right. And that kind of weird light, that kind of reminded me a bit of like almost awareness or consciousness. Like that's, if we're conscious of the way that we work, then we can see things differently, and it feels like there's a real value to that. I think we started somewhere around how do we see change as well, and that seems an interesting concept to me, because if we have however many thoughts it is, tens of thousands I think a day, then change is happening all the time. But we don't always spot that because it's happening with us, alongside us. That's where I think we were having a discussion that having somebody next to you that can kind of shine a light, to use that phrase, on another angle, another perspective can be so helpful. What's coming up for anyone else at this point?
How do we see change? It's all a matter of perspective, really. For me, it's it's also a thought of, do we want to see change? We can fix something down and say nothing's changing just through the thought, even though a gazillion things probably have already changed. But because we think, I think, oh, nothing's changed. The thought pattern is nothing's changed. So let's just say it's a relationship issue where nothing's changed in that person. They're still the same person. We still have arguments. We still do this. We still do that. That's a perception that nothing's changed, when in reality, something probably did change. We could sometimes, what often happens is that we go to our nearest friend or relative or whatever and say, we spew out, our disagreements and claim that nothing's changed and they're always the same, same arguments. And that person's perspective is hopefully going to help us, or maybe not. Often what happens is a reinforcement of our desire to be right about our thoughts, how we perceive that particular situation to be, rather than seeing a different perspective at all. I would like to reframe it and say, rather than a how-to, as where Jen was saying, maybe it's a rephrasing of the question is like, well, what if it's something else? Or what if, can we see it from this angle? And say something like fear. There's genuine fear, as in kind of like, oh my God, I'm really going to die if I don't do this. And then there's the fear of perceptive fear, where it's like, I feel threatened by some scenario that I've created in my head that most likely is completely not really worth even our time to consider. The difference, I would say, is that a genuine fear is that somatically we will feel it in such a way that we will respond instantly to what needs to get done in that moment. There's not much thinking involved there. It's like you put your hand on a hot pot, you respond instantly, for the most part. Whereas if it's a very different feeling where it's like, I think that pot's hot, so I'm not going to touch it. I get a clue sometimes where somatically, and when I say somatic, I mean one can physically feel it within our body, whether something it feels right. If a thought is, if I have a thought and I ask myself, well, do I really like that thought? How does it make me feel within the body? Is that a good feeling thought, or kind of a thought that makes me feel not so good? And which do I prefer? No, we don't often ask ourselves which do we prefer. We don't often stop and say, can there be another option here? So, and maybe a clue would be is that if we just take a moment and feel into that thought, that might give us a different perspective without having a third person there. And then inherently we can feel, is this a good feeling thought or not so good feeling thought? And just asking, and which do I prefer? Most people are going to say, I like the good feeling thought. If one wants a good feeling thought. But then the catch here is that the mind tends to go and say, oh, don't trust that feeling. So, you know, you're not thinking you're not thinking this through. And what if you're wrong? All the things come through. And just raise a bunch of questions.
Yeah, there's lots of what ifs that can come up, can't there, that stop us almost. And it reminded me as well of how often we can collect evidence of, if we think or believe something, then it's easy to just keep thinking, keep finding evidence that that thought's right, because we like to be right. Whereas actually, sometimes gaining perspective and looking at that and thinking, well, is that true? Is there maybe like is there another possibility? Like, I think even that inquiry takes us to a different place. Go on, Jen.
Yeah, and as you were talking there, I was thinking that for a lot of change to be able to see, there's a comparison element to it, that you have to be comparing. If you're talking about yourself changing, how you're seeing you now as the you in the past or the you that you want to be. And I was wondering, what if you just allowed yourself to be you and let go of some of the thinking and just around who you are and just be in the present? Because my suspicion would be that for a lot of that, there'd be something obvious to do if there's something obvious to do that would involve that change that you're busy intellectually trying to work out. So that was what was running through my head as you and Noki were both talking there.
Yeah, I think the power of noticing when we're taking action versus thinking about taking action, like there's a difference between those two things. And I think as you were pointing out, like the future in that case is like an imagined one, and the past is a remembered one, and the accuracy of both of those things is potentially doubtful, whereas right now, what does it occur to us to do? There's an answer to that question. And you take that step and then the next one follows. Edwin, anything showing up for you?
Yeah, Grant. If I were to just keep it simple for myself, need change is about seeing more. If I really focus on seeing more, and not necessarily seeing more, but maybe seeing what's truly there instead of relying on the things that I relied in the past. I think that I'm gonna be able to see things differently, simply because I'm choosing to. And I'm gonna be able to see the things that happen to be different, that maybe were there all the time. I just wasn't seeing them.
Well, no, okay.
Well, I think Edwin kind of really touches on something important here. Do we really want to see change? That very thought will put into motion the desire to actually see something that's there or not there. And because so much of what really happens in the world is imperceptible or happens so quickly, and because we have very limited sensory apparatus. We all know that a dog can hear way better than a human can. And certain animals can have much better sight, blah, blah, blah. What, from a very practical sense, I find that to be able to kind of say, and have say, evidence for change is to simply take note, literally, through some level of statistics, if you want to call it that. You write a journal. Today I did this. Today I noticed this. The next day, and if one can get really scientific and kind of say, at 1 p.m. on this day, every day, I took note of this feeling or whatever it was, right? I took note of something. And then you do a data spreadsheet and whatever else. I would say that if anyone does this at any particular level of science, if you want to call it, or one kind of consistently writes down, choose whatever they want, whatever topic, did this change? What have I noticed? In fact, it's just a matter of noticing. Probably over a span of even just a few days, one will kind of notice something. Like, we never have the same thoughts, for example, of the same topic. I've noticed when I've done a journal, for example, it's like if I were to take a topic and do it over several days, I will notice that my thoughts on that particular topic is different every day. And different kind of, I will express it differently. But the core thought may be the same. And if I were to notice, let's just say I have a bad habit that I'm trying to change or want to change, just putting it down physically in a piece of paper gives me the opportunity to have a reference point. And really, we're not able to see change until we have a reference point for most things. Unless we have a reference point, it's very difficult to say something's different. Because the reference point that isn't kind of pinpointed just changes every moment. And so how can we perceive change if the reference point is constantly moving with us? If I were on a boat, or if I was on an airplane, I can say that I didn't go anywhere. But if I'm on the airplane, that reference point says I'm in the airplane and I'm still on the airplane, but I haven't moved anywhere because I don't, perceive that I moved. Meanwhile, the plane has moved in reference to the Earth thousands of miles. That would be my just possible way of kind of seeing change.
Yeah, I love that invitation to write it down. It reminds me of, I remember a number of years ago, that was an exercise I was given when I went through a period of depression. And I looked at the journal like years later. And one event, like going to McDonald's, I'd written down as a negative, I'm eating badly. And then the same event weeks later, I'd written down as a positive, I've gone out and met people. Same event, different thinking. And I don't think, well, I got better through that process, but it was years later, even looking back at what I'd written, that I spotted even more to see. So I love the inquiry of picking a topic and just writing something down each day and noticing how does it change. Love that. Any final thoughts from anyone before we close up for today? In which case, I think we'll leave it with that invitation. Like, is there something you want to see more about, and what would happen if you write it down over a period of time? What do you see then? How might that shine the light on it? So, thanks everybody for joining our conversation today.